Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa. I'm joined by Eric Franchi and a man who volunteered to come on this pod to be roasted, Mike O'Sullivan of Sincera.
Hey guys, not exactly how I described the pitch, but I suppose that is one interpretation.
I don't know. Mike pitched us to be on the pod by saying he wanted to do a pod entitled Why Sincera is So Bad at Marketing. So generous, possibly masochistic. We're happy he's here.
Possibly both.
By way of disclosure, my fund is an investor in Sincera, and I disagree with the premise that Sincera is bad at marketing. I have to say that as an investor, I guess. Anyway, welcome to the pod, Mike.
Thank you, guys. It's exciting to be here. I've been a fan of the podcast and a listener, and yeah, it's exciting to join you.
Yes, as Joe said, the theme of the pod, the whole idea is building companies with a strong focus on go to market. So you're interesting in that you're a successful early stage founder. Company is scaling fast. Company is defining new space, but you're still figuring a lot of this stuff out. So just taking a look at what you're doing and how you're thinking about it, I think could actually be an interesting artifact for one day we all look back when Sincera is $1 billion company and get a chuckle out of some of the stuff we were thinking about in 24.
I think in many ways our conversation will be sort of like the conversation I would have with any founder if we were meeting for the first time, just talking about the positioning of the company and what they're doing from a marketing perspective. So in a way, I think for anyone who, in particular for founders and CEOs, especially of startups, but for anyone who wants to know kind of what that looks like how do you sort of get into the 101 of your marketing and analyze what you're doing, I think this will be a good example and generous of you, as I said, Mike, to offer to do it live on the pod.
It's funny because I think many people would probably think the marketing component is downstream from the offering, whether that's like product or services or what have you. And to a certain extent, that is true. But downstream does not mean a sub problem or like a smaller challenge, like a Russian nesting doll. It's like we figured this out, and then inside is the smaller problem here, which is how do we market it? And I think one of the biggest things that I've learned about starting a company is my first sort of startup experience was at AppNexus, and that I joined. I was I think employee 290, so very late comparatively. And I think in the ad tech space and broadly, people have these very big blocks for companies, stages. It's like startup is here, private but big is here, and then public is here. And the reality is if you just double click on that startup section, there's 250 stages inside that one section. So what worked in stage 7 is going to be different than what's in 19 versus 32. And you're constantly reevaluating. Because what worked before isn't what worked after, and it's also very easy to preemptively go to do something that is too early. And the last thing I would say with this very long preamble is, one, I didn't realize how sort of complex and varied that early stage is, and two, I think I felt like I would never start my own company or alongside Ian Myers, but we both never felt like we would be CEOs. And I had sort of internalized this perspective, mostly shaped by the media in many ways, which is that to be this, startup, you have to have an idea that's going to dent the universe. You have to be this massively visionary thing that needs to just sort of rock people to their core and be all right, I want to write a check. These guys are on a mission to Mars. And that was never our view of the problem space. Our view is very focused on customer feedback, implementation impact, like cumulative day over day building and solving problems. And then over time, that starts to like I said, cumulative, have a very big impact. And it's just like, there's not one way that's right or wrong. And that was very illuminating for me. It's like, there are 1,000 different ways to start and make a successful company. Like what works for Rockerbox is different than works for Sincera, it is different than works for Chalice. And all three companies, I think, are great companies, but they have a very different approaches.
I think that the way you approach marketing in the early days of a startup also really depends on, are we making an intervention in an existing category that's very much baked, or are we sort of trying to create a new category? Because if you're like, let's say you're doing a DSP for cannabis, which is something that exists. DSP is already a large category. The people to whom you're selling kind of know what that is. And you're just saying, hey, we're carving out a niche in this space, and this space has particular requirements, and we're going to be experts on that. And we're going to make advertising in this like highly regulated, complicated space very easy for you. If you're doing what I perceive Sincera is doing, then you have a very different task. And I think that because you have to create a category and you have to create understanding of what you're doing. And in that case, I think that your point about marketing not being downstream of product necessarily, or the two like informing each other, which is how I like to think about it. That's a lot more critical because, you might be, and I did this with my own company, like you might be changing the website like every 6 months, right? You're going to learn so much about how people are perceiving what you're doing, what exactly you want to build, the problems you're solving, and you're going to iterate a lot. How have you experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is there's certainly a desire to change the website every 2 or 3 months. Whether we eventually get around to it is a separate element, which kind of goes back to the sort of early hypothesis, which is bad at certain types of marketing, let's call it, or traditional startup ad tech marketing. But yes, I think your opening point, which is that we started the company and it was interesting. There were a lot of people in ad tech who didn't really see what we were solving. And to be fair, we probably did a very bad job of articulating it at the time. And that's something that gets refined over time. But being a new DSP, being an SSP, being a provider of curated packages, like when you can, like from the ad tech perspective, if you can point to somewhere on the Lumascape and say, we fit in there, that just like gives you so much contextual gasoline for people to understand what you're doing. And if you're like, we're not on here, and it's like, well, what box do I put you in? It's like, there is no box. And it's like, okay. So on one hand, you get the benefit of like having, this blank canvas to articulate what you do. The other thing is like, you better have an amazing freehand sketching ability, or otherwise people aren't going to understand what it is you just drew for them. So it is in some ways a unique opportunity. And then in another way, it can be problematic. I'll give you one other thing that you didn't mention, which is also an interesting problem, which is that you have other people in the industry who see the company and try to put you in one of those boxes. Right. So there's been different times, people have referred to this concept of like forensic ad tech. And it's like, well, yeah, Sincera is in this category. And it's like, you can learn a lot about what's happening in a given, publisher environment or something with Sincera technology and data for sure. But we're not in the business of like, investigative analysis on behalf of an agent. Right. So it's like, some cases we have to pull people back because it's a blank canvas and other people can start scribbling on it. And we're like, hey, wait a minute, we didn't necessarily agree to that. And it's like, I kind of see what you're saying, but that's not actually what we sell. That maybe is how you encounter us in the press, but that's not what we sell. That's not the solution we're bringing to enterprises.
It's interesting because if I think back to, some of the most successful companies that we've seen in ad tech, they've done both, right? So there's companies that emerged and filled the Lumascape box with an entirely new way of doing things, and like quickly became a category leader or one of the leaders, became successful, or they pushed the envelope and created a new category, a new box, and the industry sort of kind of found them, and they were de facto leaders as a result. Do you think about Sincera as having created a new box, or are you next generation for an existing box?
Yeah, good question. And one that we think about frequently. I think it is a new box. We're not alone in it, but it's a relatively emergent category. And so I think there is this category of data provider, we use the term metadata, but data provider, that's not what the industry has historically thought a data provider was. A data provider in ad tech parlance is someone who gives you audiences and charges on a CPM, right? But that term has sort of like completely been, I don't want to say co-opted, but like applied to that use case. So if you say a data provider and you come to Sincera, like, great, can you get me a list of MFA sites? We're like, no, we cannot. Ari Vibaro is like, gives us a very hard time about this, but it's like, no, because like we're not in the business of like creating CPM targeting or two, coming to conclusions. We can help you build your own custom tool to build something that you define MFA as, but I don't know what you think it is. I don't know what Joe thinks it is. I don't know what Group M thinks it is. So I think it's a new box. I think we are, it is metadata and signal data. I think we have fellow travelers on this road, but they're still not exactly the same as us. Like, we have a great relationship with Jounce, but Jounce is the company that will give you conclusions, right? They will say, this is on our, very high quality publisher list. This is on our MFA list. Like, we don't have that, but we will help you build a mechanism to do something like that. I think DeepSea will also give you conclusions, but they'll also give you some signal as well. So there are companies that are involved in this. And I think the thing that ties the three of those companies together is, from an economic perspective, this like disinterest in the outcome of a transaction. Like Sincera, because we don't have CPM fees, and that's not our business model, our only incentive is to be as accurate as possible in terms of describing what's happening, right? And that allows us to work with publishers or buy side or any of the ad tech companies. And I think in some ways it's what value are we creating and metadata and helping you build and accelerate products and stuff like that. But then how are we really different, I think, is in some ways is almost business model driven. So it's maybe a 2x2 versus a straight like Lumascape way of looking at it when you think about like different versus existing.
So would it be accurate to just say we use superior data expertise and ad tech experience to build custom ad tech?
No, I would say, okay, unfortunately, because that's more of like an IP on web description, right? I would say we help companies build and accelerate products and services in digital advertising, right? So it's not necessarily just products. Like you could be Group M and you could have your own version of the Trade Desk Global 100, right? And that could be entirely built on Sincera. And sure, we use expertise and yada, yada, yada. But what the outcome is either, customers use us in sort of one of two ways. One, they use us as an analytics tool, a data set where they can, take apart this incredibly complex ecosystem that we look in. Their analyst feeds can dig in. Or two, and this is sort of the most common, is they ingest our data and it helps them build things faster, right? A great example that's publicly shared that I can talk about is IAS's MFA product. That is used, like, there is a core set of, MFA properties that are trained on Jounce's conclusion. And then if you get Sincera signal data on every single other URL in the universe, right, you can use machine learning to say, like, what matches that particular scenario that, the signature of the Jounce list. Now, if you were to build that on your own, to go and build a system to generate and ingest 60 plus signals, right, would take, at least 9 months, a year and a half. But if you work with us, you can get that up and running in 60 days. And, you don't have to worry about sort of like carrying it. And you don't have to worry about us competing with you because we're not going to go out and sell an MFA solution. So going back to your core point, I would say what we do is we help companies, accelerate either their analytics product or service within digital advertising via metadata.
How do you shorten that, Joe?
Yeah, I guess where I would challenge you, Mike, is I think you, as the person inside the company, see a distinction. I don't know that I see a distinction. Like, I don't know. I mean, you're building ad tech, you're accelerating product offerings. It's like, I think to the market that reads as like quite similar. I don't know. I guess maybe you would say, like, would you build it's like you have companies like, I think it's Clear Code, right? My understanding is they'll like build a DSP from scratch. So like you wouldn't do that.
No. Right? So let's take the AI explosion occurring, right? And that's a broad trend, certainly in advertising, certainly in other sectors as well. What do you need to create really good AI and really good LLMs? Well, you need, data scientists, PhDs to build a model, and you need data inputted to train it. What Sincera does is that input part, the data part. Are all these ad tech companies, all these advertising companies going to go out and get their own signal data that's unique to advertising? It's not English language words. It's not publisher content, right? It's layout, it's ad configuration, it's ad environment data. So we're not going to build a DSP, but if you're building a DSP and you want to have amazing granular targeting and AI ML capabilities, you can just go to this warehouse of all of these signals. And instead of you going out and trying to think about how daunting that would be to be like, okay, we've got to figure out ad load. We need to know, or, Brian at Scope 3 said this, publicly. So this isn't secret either. It's like, you need to know every single global placement ID on the open internet, right? Like he could build that. Brian is very smart and very capable, but why bother? We'll get live faster with Scope 3's core tech if we can just ingest this from Sincera. So it's not quite like that case. And you're right. Maybe I am I definitely require a very long elevator ride for our elevator.
Yeah. You're going to the top of the Freedom Tower.
Yeah, exactly.
I get the distinction between and I see why you would push back then. I get the distinction between a clear code, again, making a DSP from scratch and using data, or as you call it, metadata, which is another thing we can talk about, to make ad tech products better.
Products or features, right? Again, that's why we often work with companies that have existing structures in place, right? It's oh, we want to come out with attention-based targeting. Great. What are all the signals that are going into determining what is high attention and low attention? Now, you can go out and get those yourself. And certainly a lot of the attention companies do get a bunch of themselves. But it's we can augment with 50 or 60 signals from Sincera that will help influence our model and make it even more higher performing. It's incorrect. So I will say this from the very beginning, but something I thought about analogous in the early days was one of the problems I experienced and Ian experiences as product people in this space is every time we wanted to build something and ingest some new kind of data, whether it was third party from a company or first party from the bid stream, you'd have to come up with this big business case. You'd have to sort of engineering be oh, the data pipeline isn't ready for this. 6 months of business strategy. What's the upside? Yada, yada, yada. So you have very little experimentation, right? Because you need to know a priori that this is going to add a lot of value, or you're going to a third party and it's yes, you can get ads.text data, just to take a very simple example, from this vendor, but we need to pay for it. And so you're paying one off, and we have to have some sort of engineering allocation to ingest this data signal. And then the next signal we want is a different company. Right now, we need to go to Media Radar to get ad spend data, and that's another 100,000. And that was very painful in terms of making high quality, high fidelity ad tech products, because you only have so much time. So that what that meant is the signal input was greatly reduced. But if you have a one-to-many, one integration to many signals coming over, it totally changes the calculus of what you can make your products with. And you can experiment way more, right? You can get more teams involved. You can get your data science teams involved and be what's the correlation? What do we like about this? What do we don't like about this? And so that doesn't change the core point that this is a long-winded explanation as to what the company does. Now, if you're Adam at Chalice and you hear this, you're this is awesome. Let's build something really cool together. But most people are not Adam at Chalice. So the question remains, right? One, how do you sort of productize and encapsulate what we've been talking about into a digestible form? So let's say Brian at Group M, right? Brian Lesser is oh, yes, totally. I can see how that could work with us. It's not super in the details and the technical aspect of it. But then also we want to make sure that we're not pulled in a gazillion different directions from people misunderstanding what it is, right? And being well, can you solve this? Can you make me a red pony? Can you make me a DSP for cannabis? Can you do this, that, and the other?
There's probably, picks and shovels is the ultimate, B2B metaphor for, infrastructure tools. There's probably a construction metaphor for this that, is like obvious, but not staring me in the face right now. But I think there's something to it in, providing the raw materials to build, those next generation products. Right. So,
Yeah.
so we're back around, right? So this idea of, metadata for building advertising products, I think, lands. I think we've agreed that you are building an emergent new box or new category with, a couple of others, which is typically what happens, right? In the emergence of a new category. What have you been doing to both, kind of drive awareness of this category and drive, the right sort of understanding of Sincera?
Good question. On your point on picks and shovels, just briefly, and Joe, maybe you can tell me if this is a good analogy or not. Something I say is I like to think of us as Intel in around 1994, 1995, where, consumers knew what the Pentium was, right? But, in order to experience the Pentium, you would have to buy from Compaq or Dell or, eventually Apple or what have you. But you knew that Pentium was synonymous with quality. And that's a little bit more of what that I think of when I think of like, analogous stories, and maybe that's complete or incomplete. But it sort of talks about how consumers will encounter this is usually through other people's products, right? Scope 3's products, IAS's products, Trade Desk products. But if Sincera is there, it's a mark of quality and performance. So that's just like, maybe not quite as like gold rushian as picks and shovels. But what we've done, and I would say, like, to answer your specific question, that's worked well for us, has worked with the press. And so the press has lots of questions. And I think, reason 1B of why we started the company is there used to be so many stories in the press, particularly around identity, which Ian and I have historically worked in, where there would be some story that would set off this 5-alarm fire because it's like, cookieless identity adoption in Europe has stalled, and the argument for that in the story would be 3 anonymous quotes from European publishers, and it's like there's no quantification here, right? And so we were able to add quantification, and we'll always work with any reporter that's from like a known reputable outlet to, one, answer their questions, add context, but two, wherever possible, provide them free quantitative analysis for the work they do. And I think that's worked quite well in helping get out who and what Sincera is. I think there's been times where we've occasionally like written a blog post and sort of like when we see something that we perhaps disagree with or think there is a quantitative gap in understanding, something, the nature of our industry. That's one side. And then the other side is that we give a significant amount of metrics away for free. And this is something we learned from Moat, right? Like our industry dashboard, Ari Gates, the one I call it that, is like, you got to come up with a better name for it, which is true. Add it to the list of marketing problems. But our industry dashboard is free for anyone who wants to see it. And, we give a ton, like we've definitely had investors and other customers say like, you're crazy. You shouldn't give this away for free. But we have at this point, 4,000 different users and people in ad tech. I can't even tell you the amount of different companies that have signed up for Sincera, the free account, right? That it's like, we don't have anyone who does outbound sales, but I suppose that person, he or she could, when they get hired, could reach out to them, right? So I think we learned a valuable lesson from Moat with that. And this is partly driven by my own irritation, because whenever I had to do something in ad tech before, it's like, call us for a demo or fax over the MFA agreements to sign it. And I'm like, we're getting our clock cleaned by the walled gardens because I can take 10 minutes with a credit card and be running campaigns. Like, we need to make this way more, like push way more of this down to the user, on their computer or on their phone, and not the demo handshake, multi-meeting type of scenario that so much of ad tech kind of runs on.
Yeah, in terms of the what, i.e. the positioning, I think something I talk about, you mentioned the elevator test, Mike. Like, I talk about the happy hour test. Like, if I were at an ad tech happy hour and I said to someone like, oh, Sincera, this or that, and they were like, what is Sincera? I need to have a single sentence that gives them a basic understanding, and that they're not going to be like, fuck you. Like, because especially as like a marketing shill, if I say something that sounds like convoluted or whatever, like someone who actually knows their stuff is going to like they're going to be like, you're like spinning some bullshit here. So I think that's where it's like that first sentence is something like, we use data or we use metadata to make ad tech products and features better. All right. That's just like the very
I think that's fair. I think you could also say it's like, their data is being used in all the most interesting and exciting ad products that are out today. And so like, Sincera, for example, has no user data in it at all. Like the system is architected to not ingest any of it. And so it's, again, both of those are kind of, Intel Pentium-esque adjacencies to my previous narrative. But I do think that is a fair point. But the only overlay I would add to what we say is like, I think it's very forward-looking products that are using this, right? It's not, it's not sort of legacy solutions that we're snapping in at like 10x cheaper, although theoretically that could be a use case as well. That's not how it's being used today.
Well, I think what you're capturing there is a message should do three things. It should clarify what you do and for whom. It should differentiate you from competitors, and it should drive urgency. I think that third bit about driving urgency, or like, why does this matter? That's kind of what you're reacting to, is like, it sounds a little banal. And I think like to just say we use data to make ad tech products and features better. But I think like where a lot of companies get tripped up is they're so concerned about capturing what's special or unique that they aren't clear. And it's like, that's why everyone makes fun of ad tech websites, because they're like, har, what does this company even do? And it's like, that's why you have the banal statement. You have the just like, everyone understands, all right, where we took the first step. And then you have the piece that differentiates you and drives urgency. And so I think, that's how I would approach that. The other thing I want to say really quickly is I love the approach of giving things away for free, because that's a mindset issue, to use entrepreneur speak. That's not just like a marketing strategy issue. And a lot of people have a lot of trouble with that, because they're like, well, we have our secret sauce that we need to, keep to ourselves, and you have to pay zillions of dollars to get it because we work so hard to figure it out. And it's like, that is an ineffective approach to marketing given current conditions. Like, given the resources available now, people are doing, let's say 80% of their research before they even buy or before they reach out to a demo. So to your point, Mike, you can't make them do a ton of work just to find out what the thing is or what's valuable about it. You need to show them how awesome it is before they even talk to you, because you have to assume that if you're not doing that, they're seeing how awesome something a competitor does is, and they're just going to the competitor instead.
I think that's correct. And, honestly, like, I'm not the first person in technology to mention or listen to, the Ben Thompson's Stratechery podcast, and thinking about like, where's the line that he has for free versus paid is something we think about too. We've had to sometimes like go tight because we had like all these IPs from Singapore trying to crawl and extract all of our data, or like 50,000 visits a day from SEMrush, right? Trying to extract, the data. So, there are costs involved with it, but in particular, I think giving away something for free has two additional benefits that you didn't mention. One, if you are a new category, seeing something visually, like I could spend as much time on the elevator as you want, but it's like, do you want to know if you're a reporter or if you're a product manager at Magnite and you're like, do we build support for Poppy? Well, go to Sincera's site and it'll tell you how many publishers today are supporting Poppy and ready to monetize it, right? It's like, it becomes very obvious and very grounded, especially for sort of like this new category, sort of point one. And in point two, there's also a legitimacy factor here because it hardens the data. Someone can say, oh, I don't think this number is right, or this isn't right. And sometimes there's something that they pointed out that we've missed or didn't understand. And we'll go back and edit and we'll change the logic in the code. And when you're new, not only do you have a understanding gap, but you have a legitimacy gap. Is this legitimate? Is this accurate? And if you're going to be in the business of providing data that people are building products and services on, like, it better be accurate. That's a process that we call hardening. And so having some metrics exposed publicly has been, you have to be comfortable with, like, again, iteration, getting things wrong, incorrect. Like, the internet is very messy, right? So like finding and measuring these things is an iterative process, and exposing some of these signals just accelerates that for us.
Question for you, Joe. You have your playbook or hierarchy of, ways to win from a marketing perspective. One of them is win with unique data and, sort of differentiated data set. Clearly, Mike has that in spades. Are there things that come to mind that you would do either uniquely with this data, or are there other tactics in your tool set that you would, recommend or give Mike to think about as how to, continue building the awareness, building the reputation of Sincera?
Yeah, well, to your initial question, Eric, you asked, Mike, how do you create a category, right? If you're not the DSP for cannabis, you have a harder challenge to get people to know about you and understand what you do. So how do you create that context and that credibility? I think, there are four ways to your point. Like, one is to have good positioning and tell a differentiated story. And I think, Sincera, like, you guys are still in the process of like working on that. We've been workshopping it on this call, right? Like, I think you started by, my impression from looking at public materials is you started by leaning into the metadata thing. Like, I don't love that because I'm like, what the fuck is metadata? Like, I'm just a dumb discourse merchant, but like, there are much smarter buyers who are like going to you for stuff. But you generally, what happens over the course of an ad tech or any tech startup is they transition more and more from like the what, i.e. metadata, to like the value, which is like creating those products and features. And as you get examples, which you now have, like the IAS MFA example is fantastic, or the Scope 3 example, it is easier to bring that to life because you're no longer dealing in hypotheticals. You can just point to very well-known companies and say, well, we did this for them. And then people can start to visualize it. So the first is that story. The second, and obviously Sincera is particularly well positioned to do this, is the show, not tell with data, right? It's if you say you have, unique data or unique ability to turn that data into value, show people how you do that, which it sounds like is the main thing Sincera has been doing, and it's been working really well. And then third and fourth are really about evangelism. It's about being prolific, present, and personable. And it's about leading the industry news cycle.
I may have some trouble with the last one you just mentioned, but the first two.
I don't think
or so. I'm told.
So there's being prolific and present, and then there's leading the industry news cycle with analysis, right? And that's another thing Sincera is well positioned to do because you're actually digging into the data and sort of analyzing what's going on. So I think like one of my main messages would be, if you're not going to be the DSP for cannabis, if you're going to create a category, you have no choice but to be an evangelist. Like there's a bias against marketing in B2B tech where people are like, I'm doing the real work. And like the marketers are just out there like saying stuff and trying to get attention. And it's like, you need attention to survive.
Right.
So, that's your point about it not being downstream, Mike.
I don't disagree with anything you've said. I think the one sort of sidewinder that I would throw at you is one of the hardest roles to hire in ad technology is marketing, product marketing. And there is only really at our stage, there's only marketing, right? There's no product marketing, event marketing, blah, blah, blah. And my experience has been, and I'm curious if Eric and you have felt the same, but it's like people who are in product marketing, who are very good at product marketing in ad technology, end up just going to product because they want to build. If they're really good at understanding and how to sell it and understanding the market, they don't want to be downstream of the build decisions. They want to be influencing the build decisions. So like the best product marketers that I've seen have already sort of migrated to product. And I find that finding resources to help with this, what you just described, to be a very challenging role to hire for. It's like an anti-Goldilocks zone because there's a lot of people, and I've seen this in different roles, where they don't know ad tech, but they have a great product marketing pedigree, let's say. They come in and they don't understand the space. So they end up doing very tactical things like, let's make you a better website. Let's make you a better decks or whatever. And product, if it's a bigger company or, the founders get annoyed because it's just like, well, I'm inputting all the stuff here. I'm actually creating the content and the story and the this, and there's just wrapping around it. And so like, that's where I historically have like really struggled, which is like, yes, I agree with everything that you said is important. So it's like my choices are either I stop building and focus on this myself or find someone to hire for it or some sort of blend of the two. But that latter point has been very difficult. So where are the Joes out there? Like you're on this podcast, so you're off the table. But like, Where's the Joe 5 years, Joe, before this minus 5 years? Like, where were you 5 years ago?
Well,
Where are those people?
I think that's the problem. Like, obviously, what you just said is why I have a business. So we'll put that aside. I think that the main mistake people make here, like, you can't your point about Goldilocks is good. You can't find Goldilocks with marketing. I think you either find someone junior who can write well, but who knows fucking nothing about marketing and ad tech. And you're just like, I'm going to tell you what to do. And you're going to be a bandwidth extension tool. And you're just going to like create stuff, right? So like, I'm going to say the words, you're going to just like fashion it into prose. And I trust you to do that, right? So that's one end. And then you could go higher. My advice would be to try to go find someone who seems smart, who's early in their career, and hire them for $60K a year or whatever, and they'll learn a ton, and it'll be a symbiotic relationship. On the other end, you could either hire a very expensive full-time person, which isn't available to most startups, or you hire someone like me, right? You hire an agency person, and then you expect that person, like the way they would work with you is like they should have input on the story. Like they shouldn't just be taking orders. They should have a take on what the story should be. They can provide context. They can insert you into the news. They can, write the content for you, yada, yada, right? So that's like the sort of expensive option. But I think what a lot of people do is like relatively early in the startup's life, they try to split the difference and they hire this person who's like been a marketing manager and they're like, you are our head of marketing. And I hate that title, head of marketing, because it almost always means you do not really have the experience to like run marketing for an organization, or I don't trust you to run marketing for an organization, but I'm going to hire you to do it because I don't want to pay for someone, or I can't pay for someone who costs, 200 to 300K a year all in. So I think those are the options. If you can't do or don't want to do either, then I think you do a little bit of what you've already been doing, Mike, which is like you lean into the data stuff if you're good at that. You find other people who are doing this well, like you find people who are good evangelists for their organization, and you try to push yourself out of your comfort zone if it is out of your comfort zone, and you imitate them. Not that you say exactly what they say, but you just see like, oh, this person seems to be like tossing off ideas about what's going on in the industry. Like read Ad Exchanger every day or read Twitter every day and see what people are saying, and force yourself to have a comment, because it'll feel unnatural at first, but that's really what the best people do. I think is they just like, they're imbricated in the industry discourse and they have a take, because all smart CEOs and founders do have some sort of take, and they get in the habit of putting it out there, even if it isn't revolutionary. Because in my experience, CEOs and founders are generally too hard on themselves. They're like, this thing I post needs to be freaking genius and no one has to have said it before. But that's not how social works, because it's about reps. It is like ads, just on a deeper level. Like you want to get in front of people.
So I just working backwards on that, I slightly disagree with you on the social part. I agree with you on the reps volume, and I agree probably more on like the LinkedIn part. I think it's very interesting. Like I think ad tech Twitter in particular is like very skewed in a very particular direction. And I think it's easy to the people who tend to emphasize the importance of ad tech Twitter tend to be a member of ad tech Twitter, is what I would say. The LinkedIn stuff, I think, is true. I think reducing the barrier to what you share is true. I think there's an additional complexifier for us, at least, which is that when you have a lot of customers and to have a take, you have to be conscious of like what your customers will think of your take. And so we try to stay away, as I mentioned before, from coming to conclusions. Now, that doesn't mean we're like milquetoast, like we can't see, like, is MFA bad? Well, we're not doing a both sides here on that kind of stuff. So those are just context points. Like I sort of agree with your overall point of like, participating in the dialogue. But honestly, like a lot of times, this is my own personal bias, like I'll see something written that gets a lot of traction and I'll be like, in my mind, like, or to Ian, I'll like be rolling my eyes because I'm like, I don't understand like what, so me participating in a dialogue about this has like, I think very little upside, quite frankly, for Sincera. And whilst it might be emotionally cathartic for me, At the time, I think it's hard to delineate between the two. Like, sure, I would love to like rip singers all the time, or I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but what I'm saying is like I would have a hard time delineating between participating in the narrative of the day and like ripping zingers. Like, for example, not to pick on Andy Moncrief, but like there was this thing where it's like, yeah, Trade Desk needs to something gorilla or whatever. They're too big, and okay, I'm not opposed to that particular position. And Joe, I think you commented on it, but I was like, there was all this like thumbs up. Yeah, totally. Way to speak truth to power. And it's like, what was the argument as to why this was the case? Like there wasn't any evidence or explanation as to why that was the thing. So like, I feel like I would have a hard time participating on some of these things. That doesn't mean we can't be. We talk way too little, I think, and we share too little things. Like we find very interesting things. Like we have this new discovery that we're calling volatile header wrappers. And like, we're super excited about it, but it's like, you know, writing and talking about it is important, but not urgent. And then every day we're building new things for customers, and it's just like, we never got around to doing that, right? And so that is something to be solved, because I agree with your point. Like we shouldn't go through these long periods of radio silence, and like having an ongoing discussion that's authentic and not like social media manager-esque. Like it is super important. I just think the anchor point for us needs to be interesting things that we discover, as opposed to participating in the commentary of the day.
I completely agree, Mike. You are a very gifted explainer of all these topics that you know we care about within ad tech, and there's no shortage of things that need to be explained, right? And provided context on, and even the question around like what's behind what Andy's talking about. Right. So I think there's a very natural role there, and it connects very well with what you're doing at Sincera. On the hiring front, what has worked for me, and I've seen work at companies at the size and stage of Sincera, Bach actually, I think he explained this quite well when he was on the pod a few weeks ago. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically he was like, we hired really smart people that had like, this kind of specific skill set. Maybe, Joe said they write really, really well. And we taught them the AppNexus way. And I think, again, with the uniqueness of Sincera and the size of the company and the stage of the company, I think, again, if I were giving you advice, I don't think I am. Or maybe I am.
Please do. I'm very open.
Yeah. It's like somebody that, has that spark, to use the Bach term, has that sparkle, right? Like from a marketing lens perspective, think they're talented. And you teach them the Sincera way, and they become the, kind of either voice or voice behind you for Sincera. They grow within the organization, and that could end up being somebody that becomes, a very important person to the company over time. I've seen that work. I've had it work. That would be my thought around if you were to make a hire in this area, that can be like an amplifier for you.
Two things. I think like one, agree. Where are those people? What is the heuristic I use to find those people? I'm very open to trying that. And two, I was a product of that AppNexus environment. Whilst I wasn't in the marketing side, I certainly know what it was like to go through and sort of experience the AppNexus ways. And like overwhelmingly, that has absolutely influenced how I think about hiring people. Like I would say 85 to 90% in a positive way. There are downsides and some issues with it, but overwhelmingly positive. But at the same time, at one point, 30% ish of AppNexus was from Princeton. And then AppNexus could also, like, they had this amazing recruiting machine that could pull a bunch of people who had done consulting or finance for 2 or 3 years and didn't like that world. And they, AppNexus created a very effective pipeline for super high intellectual horsepower individuals to transition into tech. And it was genius. It was like super well done, super well executed. That's again, going back to our first point on stages, like it's discovery. Like the first thing, like a good friend of mine, Eddie Cho, who's I think AppNexus employee 8 or 15, very early, maybe not 8, 15, 20, first services person, first implementation services person. He responded to an ad on a Princeton job board, right? Is that what we do? I don't know, maybe, but like, what are those job boards of the now?
So I think, number one, the job board of the now is podcasts. So I think with you speaking this on this podcast, you're going to get some inbound just from that is sort of thought A. Thought B, I had like very good experiences with internship programs with, seeing people that are, juniors or upcoming seniors that, wanted to just get generalized experience in tech, maybe, coming from a place that has more of a, kind of advertising and marketing lens to the program. And then we would just hire the best. And the conversion rate from like good intern to good, kind of entry level individual contributor to rising within the org. Again, this is, back in the day at Undertone was really good. So, to think about that as a non-standard way to do this.
In terms of the talent piece, I mean, I'm also in your position, Mike. Like, I need to find sort of junior writers who can be bandwidth extension. And almost everyone I've hired has been like, they either have like a humanities academic or like journalist background. And I went to Brown, I did a PhD, so I sort of like know some of those people and I could just like bring them in. But I would look at those job boards and find the kids on the newspaper. Those people are freaks. They want to work like 40 hours for free a week, just like for fun. Mm-hmm. So those are like a couple very tactical things. In terms of the controversy, I think you've already sort of solved it. Like the answer, there are two ways to go about that. If you don't want to clap back or you don't want to like publicly really critique a major company in the industry, one way is you can participate in a controversial discussion without being controversial yourself. So funnily enough, if you look at Andy's tweet from a couple weeks ago, I commented like, "Hey, Andy, I think you're saying this, but I'm not clear. Could you elaborate?" And then he got more specific. And then I was like, "Okay, I think you're saying this." Right? That's a perfect example of a way to engage with someone who's driving news and driving attention without like necessarily getting sucked into the controversy. You don't have to be like, "Oh my God, this is vacuous. You're not actually saying something. I hate you." Like it doesn't have to be, a clapback. You could sort of diplomat. Mike's making a face like, "But I don't want to. I'm going to want to clap back. And then I have to keep the demons inside."
I guess like it's not so much that I want to clap back, although perhaps there's some of that. It's just that I feel like there's so much. I'm sure everyone says this about their industry, but there's so much. Let's call it like not necessarily misinformation, but like cherry picked explanations and things. And I'm just like, yeah, I think you're right. The devil's in the details. I think in some ways, perhaps LinkedIn is a better vehicle for this because like Twitter is just too ephemeral and too emotional. But I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. For example, here's a counterpoint to my own thing. I posted something. I posted a tweet that was it was like the Google trial had this like a slide of, here's how we demonstrate there's this amazingly healthy ad ecosystem. It was hilarious because it was like they controlled all of this for these like couple little boxes. And so I made it about like,
spaghetti football.
And so I made a spaghetti football for like, household responsibilities of like how I illustrate to my wife that I'm doing my part, which is like, I'm the tiny little thing past here. And that got like, 10 or 15,000 impressions, like organically, and all these people following me. So I think in some ways, like maybe I'll more of an irreverent commentary versus, actually participating is perhaps more useful for me and for Sincera and protects the company a little bit more. The other thing I do want to mention, whilst we still have a little bit of time, Joe, and get your thoughts on is a company that I've always admired. And maybe you could say this is just a coping mechanism. But a company that I've always admired when I was driving into San Francisco one day, like visiting customers or whatever, was a big billboard. And it was like, Twilio, like ask your best developer about us. And I found that to be like a very impactful message for a couple of reasons. Like one is it's like people who know about this product. Right. And it's not necessarily for everyone, although you may encounter like, hundreds of billions of people encounter Twilio technology, but they don't even know it. Right. And so like that resonated with me. I think the fact that it's like, ask your best or ask the most, prolific or sort of like forward thinking individuals. I think that resonates for me in terms of how Sincera is used. And then the third thing that I think resonates for me, and even honestly going through this conversation, I'm a little bit like cringing internally because like don't talk about the company this much, certainly not in a public forum, but this is still very useful, is like, we want our customers' products, right, to be the focus, like in some ways. And I don't know how I don't think that changes everything you said about the necessity of having something like crisp to say that's like non BS that people will get, the importance of having things public. Like all of that remains true, but there is an element, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts of like, how do we protect and nurture this fact that it's like, we want our customers' products to be successful, because like, we're not successful unless, Scope 3's performance-based offerings are successful, and so on and so forth. So I don't like when people just say, do case studies. And it's like, what, when was the last time anyone downloaded a PDF to read? So like, again, it doesn't have to be a PDF, but like, what do successful companies that help other companies be more successful look like? And because I don't like the idea of like, chest thumping when you point to your customers' success.
Yeah. We'll close with this because I know we're at time. So the first thing is the Twilio example perfectly illustrates the concept that you start off with, what are we doing for whom? Like with it being very clear, because if you go to their homepage, it says get RCS on Twilio messaging, no code changes required, right? Like just telling you what they give you, but then they're creative. Like the secondary messaging is, ask your best developer about us, which is that creates credibility. It creates an aura around the brand, right? It drives urgency. Like, oh, why don't I know about this if my best developer knows about it? And it differentiates them, right? Because they're the software that your best developer knows. So that's an interesting piece about how like different messages sort of work together to flesh out an understanding of a brand. In terms of putting your customers in the spotlight, I mean, to me, it's tricky if they won't allow you to talk about them. That's always when it's just really hard. For those who will and who are happy to sort of stand with you, then you make them the hero of the story, and you get it out. You're right. It's partially about format and medium because like, someone's probably only going to download a case study if they're like deep in the sales process or if they're like deep in the research process. But you can ungate those things for one, which makes it easier. But you can also just talk about it in your messaging. Like, I've been talking about Viant recently because Viant has been like crushing it with marketing and orchestrating attention. And so like I talk about them on Twitter in my newsletter, we had them on the pod, et cetera. Right. So you just do it in a way that feels organic.
Yeah. Final. There's something staring you in the face, I think, Mike, right? Which is, this is like this should be the best source of metadata to build ad products. TTD, like kind of proudly promoted that Sincera data was used for the TD 100 and SP 500 plus. So it's like more of that. One could imagine that in a different world, there is a billboard with Jeff Green on it, and it's like SP 500, powered by Sincera or Sincera inside. To go to your Intel example, I think there's certainly like something to that you should press more on.
Yeah, well, I'll leave it to you to mention that to him about participating on the billboard. But I take your core point. And, I wanted to say thank you guys for the time. Like, it's super thought provoking. By no means do we consider this a solved problem. This is very much an open problem that we are not experts in. So, yeah, thank you for having me on and for indulging, my, all my questions, but also, my idiosyncratic nature of tweeting.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and for the openness to just talk about things and workshop in real time. We appreciate it.
I forgot it was a podcast.
Right, we're doing great our job, work guys. Sessions on the pod now. Eric doesn't have enough time. He's trying to optimize. All right, thanks so much, guys. If you like this, subscribe, like us, etc. See you next week.
Bye-bye, everybody.